Hi everyone, this will be a walkthrough of the George Harris article, Fathers and Fetuses. As the title suggests, Harris is going to draw our attention to an oft-neglected aspect of the abortion debate, that is to say, the role of the father. Very often the debate over abortion is construed entirely in terms of the rights of the mother versus the rights of the child, and that makes a certain degree of sense, of course, because those are the two primary participants. But it's worth remembering, of course, that as the saying goes, it takes two to tango. It isn't just a mother in the picture, there's also a father in the picture. And so Harris wants to ask whether or not it's ever wrong for a woman to get an abortion, not on the grounds that it wrongs the fetus, that it sort of violates the fetus's right to life or something like that, but rather on the grounds that it violates the rights of the father in some way, or harms or wrongs the father in some illegitimate way. And he comes up with 5 thought experiments that are designed to sort of draw our intuitions to the idea that it's possible in at least some circumstances for an abortion to be wrong because it violates the autonomy of the father. It trespasses in a way that's morally unacceptable on what the father has a legitimate right to. So for the purposes of this essay, Harris is going to completely set aside the question of the moral status of the fetus. So the kinds of conversations we've been having before now about personhood, about whether or not the fetus has a right to life and what that entails and so forth, all of that stuff is set aside. It's not that he's agnostic or neutral on that. It's just it's not important for this article, for this argument. He's willing to concede to the pro-choice side of the argument that the fetus has no rights, it's not a person, etc. And he wants to say that in some circumstances, at least, it's still morally unacceptable for a woman to have an abortion. So what I want to do is I want to start by walking through the 5 thought experiments, just sort of repeating them from the reading, getting them fresh in your memory, and then we'll go through them one at a time and analyze them. So starting with case 1. Case 1 is the case of Karen. Karen is raped by a man with severe mental problems. The man is captured. He gets therapy. He recovers completely. He realizes what he did. He apologizes to Karen. He accepts full liability. He's even willing to go to jail if that's what it takes. All he does is ask one thing of Karen. He pleads with her not to abort their baby because Karen got pregnant as a result of the rape. Karen, however, is psychologically devastated because of the rape, as is quite understandable, and therefore she chooses to abort. Now, does this violate the rights of the father? Again, that's sort of going to be the repeating question. We're not going to answer that question just yet. We'll answer it later on, but that's sort of what you want to be asking yourself as we go through each of these cases. So that's case 1 of Karen. Case 2 is the case of Jane and Jack. Jane and Jack are college students in a casual sexual relationship. There's no serious emotional commitment. They're just having fun, and Jane gets pregnant. Jack, at this point, confesses to Jane that he is a devout Catholic. Now, what a devout Catholic is doing having a casual sexual relationship, well, you can figure that one out for yourself. But this sort of thing happens, and so he proposes a marriage to Jane and says they can keep the baby and raise the baby. But Jane wants neither husband nor baby. That's not at all what she signed up for. This is not something that she was interested in. So Jack offers to take full financial responsibility and parental responsibility for the baby. All Jane has to do is take the baby to term, and then she can have as much or as little involvement in the baby's life and Jack's life for that matter as she wants. He will do everything that she doesn't want to do. All she has to do is keep the baby to term. Despite this, Jane chooses to abort. So again, the question, does this in some sense trespass on Jack's rights? Does it violate his morally legitimate interests, etc., and so forth? Again, we will return to the Harris's answer to this question a little later on. I'll stop asking that question every time now. You get the idea, but you should hold that in your head as we go through each of these cases. Okay, so there's cases 1 and 2. Let's turn now to case 3. Case 3 is the case of Susan and Charles. Susan and Charles are in their 5th year of marriage. Charles desperately wants a family. That's the thing that's mattered to him the most from the beginning. It matters more to him than his career or money or leisure time or any of that stuff. Susan, however, is actually kind of ambivalent. She's torn. She doesn't know whether or not she really wants children. She loves her husband, and she sees how much he loves the idea of children, but she just doesn't quite have the heart to tell him that she's on the fence. She sort of figures, what, she'll get it sorted out eventually. Maybe it won't be a thing. Maybe there's going to be no need to have a conversation here. So she just lets him go on believing that she wants a child. Now, despite the fact that Susan and Charles use birth control, Susan becomes pregnant right at the exact same time that her career gets a massive boost. And Susan thinks very long and hard about this. Again, she's not too sure if she wants kids, but she is very much committed to her career. This is the boost that she's been wanting for a very, very long time. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and if she doesn't take it, it's probably never going to happen again. And so she weighs the value of what's going on here, and she decides that she prefers her career to motherhood. Now, Charles, of course, offers to be a stay-at-home father, to sacrifice his own career so she can pursue hers after she has the child, but by then it will be too late for this for her to take this opportunity. So in spite of Charles's very generous attempts to pick up the slack, Susan still opts for an abortion. Okay, that's case 3. Now to case 4. Case 4 is the case of Michelle and Steve. Now, Michelle and Steve is very similar in some ways to the previous case, but there's a minor variation. In this version, Michelle has always known she doesn't want children. She's never been ambivalent. She's been very clear in her own head she does not want children. And she actively deceives Steve. She leads him along, tells him things that are out and out false, that she wants kids, not because she's cruel or mean, but just because she has a plan, and that plan is to gradually, over time, convince Steve that children actually really aren't good for them, that children ruin marriages, that all their friends who have children end up being unhappy, and that it's generally not really good for people to have kids. That's her strategy, to slowly convince him of that over time. But before she can implement that plan, Michelle ends up getting pregnant. Same as before, Steve offers to take all the parenting responsibilities, but in spite of that, Susan decides to abort anyway. There's case 4. Now, 5th and final case, Anne and Mark. Anne hates men. All of them. The entire gender, it's something that she thinks that they're just horrible, horrible, horrible people, and she wants to penalize them in the worst way possible. So she picks on one unlucky soul as a stand-in for all of maledom. This is the unfortunate soul is named Mark. And she seduces Mark with promises of a family life together, and Mark falls madly in love with her. He marries her, expecting to start up a family, and over time, Mark gives up everything that he had had. He gives up his business, his house, his friends, all so he can commit himself more and more to Anne and their future children. Anne becomes pregnant and keeps up the charade of the happy, doting wife and the loving mother until the 9th month, and then at the last minute, she has an abortion to Mark's horror, and she just loves every second of it. His horror, his heartbreak, his pain, his agony, that's exactly what she wanted, and she couldn't be happier because of it. Okay, so those are all 5 cases. Now, again, the reoccurring question is are any of these cases instances of a wrongful abortion because of what happens to the father? And hopefully, you can sort of see these cases scale. They start off with fairly relatively innocent and end up being absolutely horrific. So to sort of give you the bottom line, what Harris thinks, and again, for the record, you by no means have to agree with Harris on this. You can disagree with him on some of these cases or even all these cases, but this is what he thinks. Harris thinks that cases 3, 4, and 5 would all be wrong because of what they do to the father. Cases 4 and 5 in particular wouldn't just be wrong. They're so wrong that they're morally impermissible. So cases 1 and 2, he thinks, are morally permissible. The woman is within her rights, no matter how much the father might be hurting in cases 1 and 2. It's not incumbent upon the mother to keep the child. So let's see his argument for this, right? How does he justify having this position on these 5 cases? Well, Harris is drawing his case principally on a Kantian notion, namely this notion of the respect for autonomy of persons. It's worth noting here he is not a utilitarian. For him, the bottom line is not how much does the father suffer in this situation. The father in cases 1 and 2 might suffer terrible, terrible pain and agony, but that's not the morally relevant consideration for him. As a Kantian, Harris is not so much concerned with how much pain is going on. He's concerned with the notion of respecting people's autonomy. And to sort of show how this works, consider the following scenario. Imagine that 2 people, a loving couple, choose to have a baby. She gets pregnant. They're very happy about this. She carries the baby to the 9th month, and then a mugger attacks her, and she has a miscarriage. Now, what do we make of this case? Now, without a doubt, of course, this is a harm to the woman. The mugger attacks her. causes her physical pain, and then of course the emotional trauma of losing the child. That's clearly a harm to the woman. And based on what we saw in the previous lecture talking about neural development, it's probably actually easy to say that this is the harm to the fetus. By the 9th month, the fetus is capable of feeling pain, and so the process of miscarrying would probably cause the fetus considerable pain. And so it looks like you've at least harmed two parties here. You've harmed the mother, you've harmed the child. But doesn't it make sense to say that the mugger has also harmed the father? In the same way that the mugger is stealing something from the woman, something emotional, something the woman is sort of tied to, invested in, and something the woman cares about, he's doing the same thing to the father. Both parents in this scenario have a morally legitimate interest in procreating and having children, and they are emotionally invested in this unborn child in such a way that when that unborn child is taken away from them, the person who takes them away, in this case the mugger, is doing something wrong. They have violated the autonomy of both parents in this scenario. So if you agree with that, and again, I think this is a fairly uncontroversial case, it shows that it's at least possible for the death of a fetus to not just harm, but to wrong the father in a way that's morally impermissible if it's done as a result of a deliberate act like the mugger attacking the pregnant woman. And if that's the case, it's not too hard to see how at least the foot in the door is Harris's foot is in the door to make the argument that in certain circumstances a woman choosing to have an abortion can also wrong the father in this way. So let's turn back to the cases and sort of unpack them one at a time, starting with case one. Now, case one, in Harris's estimation, does not wrong the father. And the reason why is because when the father raped, again, it's worth noting the father doesn't even have a name in this scenario. He's just an unnamed rapist. I think that's deliberate on Harris's part to show how distant he is from it. He's not invested in this scenario. He was not in control of his actions when he raped Karen. He wasn't asserting his autonomy. When he and Karen gave rise to the child in this scenario. So if he didn't assert his autonomy, then he can't possibly lay claim to his autonomy. The only relationship between the rapist and the child in this scenario is merely biological. And a mere biological relationship in Harris's mind is not enough to give the father a legitimate claim to the fetus, especially one that would trump the mother's right to control her body. So at a bare minimum, the consent of the mother is going to be, when it comes to the sex act, is going to be necessary in order for the father to have the kind of claim that one might need in order to say, morally speaking, that they have a right to the child. The rapist has no right to the child because both because he did not assert his autonomy, he wasn't in control of himself in this scenario, and because the mother didn't agree to the situation as well. So in this situation, as Harris sees it, Karen is not doing any wrong to the father when she has an abortion. What about case two? Case two is Jane and Jack. Now remember, this is the casual sexual relationship. Now Jane and Jack go into this scenario in a way that's kind of symmetrical, right? Neither of them want a child. Neither of them are planning on having a child. It happens accidentally. But even though they go into the scenario symmetrically, there is an asymmetry in the situation. As Harris reads it, Jane has a claim over the fetus in a way Jack does not. And the reason why is because they both sort of stumbled into this. Neither of them asserted their autonomy. Neither of them wanted to have children, chose to have children, tried to have children. In that respect, they're paired off. Now, it would be a different scenario if Jack had communicated his thoughts on abortion in advance. If he had told Jane, look, I'm having a lot of fun with this, but you should know that I'm a Catholic, and if you get pregnant, this is what I would want. That would be a different scenario. But in the original version, as Harris puts it forward, by failing to communicate, by failing to put her in a situation where she has to choose what the value of his autonomy and how to weigh his autonomy were she to get pregnant, by not doing that, by not asserting his autonomy, she sort of surrenders the decision over to her because her autonomy is inescapably tied up in this. Remember, it is, after all, her body. So because her body is gestating the fetus, her autonomy is inevitably invested in this from day one in a way that Jack's autonomy is not. Now, it's worth noting something here. I want to take a quick aside because Harris brings something up which is worth thinking about here, because this is another aspect of the abortion debate which is rarely brought up. There is a strange asymmetry here. It seems as though if we're going to say that Jane should not be obliged to be a mother in a situation like this if she doesn't want to, then shouldn't it also follow that Jack is not obliged to be a father if he doesn't want to? Now, in every jurisdiction that I'm familiar with, if a man gets a woman pregnant in a scenario like this and the woman chooses to keep the baby, then the father is obliged to pay child support. Now, notice that's kind of strange, right? That sort of seems like it's by some ways of looking at it, least, it's kind of unfair. What it's saying is that women have a right in a scenario like this that men don't. Women have the right to decide whether or not they are going to be a mother, but the father has no right to decide whether or not he's going to be a father. The woman gets to make that decision for him. Now, obviously, you could dig into this sort of scenario in a lot more detail. There's a lot of relevant factors which I'm not considering. I just want to sort of put a pebble in your shoe there to sort of make yourself think about that, right? To what extent, if any, is this unfair? Is this asymmetry between allowing women to be mothers, but not to decide whether or not they want to be mothers, but not allowing men whether or not they want to be fathers in a scenario like this? Is that fair? Is that unfair? And if so, why? Like I said, that's up to you. Anyway, moving on to case 3, Susan, Charles, and negligence. The way Harris reads this situation, if Susan has an abortion, she wrongfully harms Charles. She had a responsibility to him to disclose her feelings, to say, look, honey, I got to level with you. I'm kind of ambivalent about kids. I don't know whether or not I want to have kids. And because she failed that responsibility, she failed to communicate herself, she did not assert her autonomy. Charles asserted his autonomy. Charles told her exactly what he wanted. There was no mystery there. He did his duty. He did what he was responsible for. And in that respect, Harris thinks he has a claim on the fetus. He has a legitimate moral claim to this child. And when Susan has the abortion, she wrongfully harms Charles. She violates his autonomy because he asserted his autonomy. She failed to assert hers. At the same time, though, even though this is wrong, even though this is harmful, Harris doesn't think that Susan's abortion is so wrong that it's morally impermissible, that it's something that is sort of a fundamental violation, because Susan's moral right to control her body still matters. And that's still something that gives her a certain amount of weight in this scenario. That is to say, he doesn't quite put it this way, but I imagine that if Harris were sort of the king or the judge or whatever in this scenario, and he was deciding in a case-by-case scenario, he would probably let Susan have the abortion, but he would judge her considerably for it. It's not impermissible. It's not something that should be prohibited in this sort of scenario, but it is clearly wrong. It's something someone shouldn't do. Next up, Michelle and Steve. Now remember, this case was the case that was very similar to the previous case, except Michelle she's not just negligent, she actively deceives her husband. She lies to him deliberately and knowingly about her desires to have a child. Now, in Harris's mind, this shifts the burden of justification completely. When you aren't just negligent, when you are actively deceitful, you are actively undermining your partner's autonomy in this respect. So Steve is asserting his autonomy, and Michelle isn't just failing to assert her autonomy, she is undermining Steve's autonomy. Put the point this way. Susan's negligence is understandable. People are sometimes ambivalent. They're sometimes conflicted. They don't know how to have these conversations. That's not a good thing. Indeed, it's a bad thing, but it's understandable. It's forgivable. But Michelle's deceit is not forgivable. Lying about something like that is something that is just a bridge too far. It is a fundamental violation of Steve's autonomy. And therefore, when she does this, she surrenders her right to ultimately have the final say in whether or not she keeps this child. So for that reason, if Michelle has an abortion, it's morally impermissible. And the final case, the case of Anne and Mark, isn't just a case of deceit. It's a case of active malice, the intent to harm. She's lying not because she intends to convince him otherwise, like the previous case, eventually. No, she wants to hurt him. She's going out of her way to try to cause him pain, to violate him in the most emotionally intimate way possible. So, on that way of thinking about things, when Anne does this, again, she surrenders her autonomy. She surrenders her right to control her body when she engages in this kind of malice. That kind of malice undermines her claim to control her body. By doing this, by putting Mark in this situation, she gives him a tremendous amount of power in the claim towards his autonomy. And he should be allowed to assert that autonomy to say, this is my child. I am taking this child away from you. Think about it this way. Think about if Anne actually kept the child to term, but told him how much she hated him, how well, frankly, practically psychopathic this woman is. If you were the judge, wouldn't you want to take the child away from Anne? Doesn't she seem like the person who's not a stable parent? She's not the kind of person who should be trusted with a child. And if she shouldn't be trusted with a child, then maybe she shouldn't be trusted with a choice, if I can sort of turn that popular pro-choice bumper sticker on its head right there. If Anne can't be trusted with a child, then she shouldn't be trusted with a choice. This is Mark's decision. Now, of course, there are going to be extreme pro-choice people, I think, who are going to deny this. You can even sort of imagine a Thompson-esque violinist case to sort of mirror this one, if you will. But let's not go there for now. Let's simply say that, again, I hope you see the spectrum nature of this. Now, some people are going to agree with Harris straight up. Some are going to disagree on some cases, but agree on others, and some people are going to disagree on all. And as always, you're free to do that. But I hope you can sort of appreciate sort of how he has constructed these 5 thought experiments to create a scale, to put more pressure on you. If you lean more pro-choice, you're going to have a harder time defending case 5. Whereas if you lean case pro-life, you're going to have a harder time defending case 1. And if you're on the fence, then you got to draw the line somewhere between 1 and 5. Okay, so I want to sort of consider some potential problems, potential objections to what Harris is putting forward here. Maybe the issue isn't really with abortion per se. Maybe what's interestingly about these cases has actually nothing to do with abortion. Someone could say that, look, in cases 3, 4, and 5, what's the morally relevant issues here are precisely the negligence, the deceit, and the malice. These things are wrong in any moral context, the argument would go. There's nothing special about abortion here. You shouldn't be negligent towards your responsibilities, you shouldn't deceive people, and you should not act with malice towards people. This is true whether or not you're talking about a business arrangement or you're talking about having a child. Maybe the problem with Harris's thought experiments is he's actually sort of detached himself from what's supposed to make abortion interesting, namely this idea that there is a life inside the woman, and that's what's supposed to make it problematic. Again, you can go back and reinvent all these scenarios and imagine that none of these women ever got pregnant. But in cases 3, 4, and 5, it still seems like those women are doing something wrong. These are things that the women shouldn't be doing, regardless of whether or not they get pregnant. Now, I think what Harris would say in response to this is that this may be true, but it's not the whole truth. It would have been wrong for them to do these things even if they did get pregnant. But given that they did get pregnant, it seems like that compounds things. That makes it even worse. It's not just that the men have been deceived. It's not just that there was negligence. It's not just that there was malice. It's that negligence, deceit, or malice manifests itself in a situation which completely and utterly emotionally devastates the father in these scenarios. It's something that undercuts the thing that they want most in their life, this thing that they've been looking forward to. They've been emotionally and financially and socially invested in. By undercutting that investment, by destroying that claim, they're doing something worse than simply being negligent, deceitful, or malicious. So it does seem as though pregnancy changes the game, even though it's certainly true that negligence, deceit, and malice are indeed wrong. Okay, well, what about other allegedly morally legitimate interests? Could someone take the argument that Harris has been making here and try to sort of leverage it and say, well, look, if the father in certain circumstances has a right to say that a woman can't have an abortion, are there any other parties that might have a morally legitimate interest in the fetus? Go to example here. In World War II, abortion was outlawed in the country of Italy because the government wanted to make sure that there would be enough soldiers to fight in the future. And you could imagine, someone from the government saying, look, we understand that women have a right to control their bodies, but the preservation of the state, the preservation of our culture and our government are at stake here. We need soldiers, and that means that we're going to prohibit women from having any abortions. And this is something that's justified on the sort of Harris-esque argument because the state has a morally legitimate interest in making sure that there will be future children. You could also imagine a scenario in which the father is out of the picture, but maybe the would-be grandparents come in and say, hey, this woman's not allowed to have an abortion because she would be killing our grandchild. Would that be a situation where you could use an argument like Harris's to say that a mother doesn't have a right to control her own body? Well, Harris rejects both of these scenarios. He doesn't think either of these scenarios follow from the kind of argument that he's been making. A morally legitimate interest in sex does not override a woman's right to be raped. I mean, again, sex is something that people have a legitimate interest in. It's a basic human need. Human beings want sex, and it's an understandable thing for them to do so. But that just because someone wants sex, you could even say that in some sense human beings have a right to sex, but they don't have a right to sex in such a way that overrides a woman, or for that matter, a man's right not to be raped. And by the same token, the state can't force a woman to have a baby against its own will just because they have an interest in having more soldiers or more taxpayers or whatever. And similar sort of thing for the grandparents. Neither the state nor the grandparents are in the same kind of moral investment relationship that a father is in cases 3, 4, and 5. The woman's autonomy is clearly going to trump, Harris thinks, in those scenarios. Okay, final objection. These cases seem kind of implausible in a lot of ways. I mean, something like case 3 and 4 might happen occasionally from time to time. It's certainly not science fiction, but it's not what you would call a mainstream case of abortion. The vast majority of cases of abortion look nothing like this. And in particular, of course, case 5 seems like pure fiction. I mean, again, I'm not saying there aren't people out there who aren't malicious in the way that case suggested, but it seems just like it's the kind of thing that's like bad fiction to imagine someone who would go out of their way to seduce somebody, marry them, get pregnant, pretend, keep up the charade, and then have an abortion at the last minute. The world is a big place. There's a lot of people, and some of them are terrible, so I can't say it would never happen, but it seems grossly implausible. At a bare minimum, the vast, vast, vast majority of abortions are nothing like this. So the objection goes, we shouldn't really think that Harris has proven anything because these scenarios are kind of fantastic. And now this is true, of course. There is a certain amount of tailor making with these cases. They're written specifically to evoke these particular intuitions. But this exact same thing is true of Thompson's violinist thought experiment. And it's still generally considered to be the case that Thompson's violinist thought experiment sheds light on abortion, even though there's never been a situation like Thompson's violinist experiment in the history of the world. It's analogous enough to certain scenarios that do happen that we can say that it's worth talking about. And we can say the same thing about Harris's cases. Even if nothing like case 5 has ever actually happened, there's moral, psychological things going on there, like malice, like spite, which do play a role in relationships sometimes. Ditto for negligence and deceit. So if that's the case, then what exactly does Harris think his cases are bringing to light? What do they show us and tell us about abortion as a moral dilemma? Well, he thinks that what they bring to light is the fact that women and men both have obligations to communicate to each other, to say what it is that they want out of sex, whether or not they want to have children, what it is that they are emotionally and psychologically and socially invested in. You can sort of take this somewhat as a public service announcement. If you are having sex, either now or in the future, I realize it can be difficult in some ways to have these conversations. They can be kind of heady, but you should have them, even if it is a casual sexual relationship. There's a moral obligation to get on the same page about these things, because if you don't do that, if you don't get on the same page and something does go wrong, then there's a very good chance that someone is going to be in a compromised position. So if the relationship is just about sex, or if it's just about a commitment but not about a family, or about a family, what should happen in these scenarios? When considering the ethics of abortion, we have to recognize that it's not simply one decision. It's not simply the decision whether or not to have an abortion. It's a series of decisions that puts people in the position where they have to make that decision. So this is an invitation in many ways to reflect more deeply on the ethics of sex in general, on the relationship between sex and pregnancy, on the relationship that men and women have, about the commitments that they have to their potential offspring and to each other, to communicate and to be honest with themselves and with each other. And if people did a better job of discharging their moral obligations in that regard, maybe the moral problems of abortion wouldn't come up quite so much.